So now we're going to move on to Module 2, Part 2, and we're going to talk a little bit about how to select and administer and score CBMs in reading. Some of this might be familiar to you, so it'll be a good refresher, and for some of you this might be your first time selecting and administering curriculum-based measurement. So in particular, we're going to be talking about what CBM is, how we select an appropriate CBM measure in reading, and then we're going to talk about how to administer and score common CBMs in reading. And finally, we're going to talk more about how to select assessments for progress monitoring in particular. So you remember we went through and looked at this framework from the National Center on Intensive Intervention before that really gives us that overview of DBI in general and can be applied to reading. Let's talk a little bit about how progress monitoring fits in here in particular. You see progress monitoring indicated a couple of times up here in the model. Here's one time, we've got that progress monitoring. Down here, we've got that progress monitoring, but let's talk a little bit more about how that fits into the model. So CBM generally we think of as a general outcome measure or an overall indicator of proficiency and progress in an academic area like reading. And so this answers the question, how are students responding to the intervention I'm delivering? So this initial progress monitoring, or the progress monitoring along the way, gives us a sense of how students are responding to the intervention we're delivering. Next, we have some diagnostic assessment, and we talked about this a minute ago when Ms. Smith worked with Zane to really implement some phonics measures. Here's that diagnostic piece right here. She actually learned a little bit more about what specific skills to target for Zane. This diagnostic assessment answers the question, what specific reading skills or strategies do I teach next? And then we sometimes combine that CBM information with error analysis. So we go back and we look at patterns of errors in the material that's been collected, and we match that with some type of mastery assessment like exit slips, could be some individual reading inventories, some running record information even. We put those materials together to learn more about how to refine instructional focus and determine if students are really mastering the information that you're teaching. So these pieces together, these progress monitoring pieces, fit really well into that framework that we talked about before. We're going to talk a lot more about progress monitoring, but that kind of gives you a sense of how that progress monitoring data, some of those questions that are answered for that information along the way. The focus of this entire module is on progress monitoring data using CBM. And so we're going to continue to think about and look in particular at that CBM as a general outcome measure and CBM as progress monitoring. So we mentioned this before, but one of the first questions that we're considering is how students are responding to the intervention we're delivering. We're thinking about, are students meeting our short and long-term goals? Are they making progress at an acceptable rate? And does the instruction need to be adjusted or adapted? You can think about in the graphs that we saw before, there were some adaptations that teachers implemented as they really were persistent in their instruction. When they went along and looked at the data, the data might have suggested that a change need to be made, and the teacher then would use diagnostic information to dig in, to make that change, and then to continue to progress monitor. That DBI information really prompts you as a teacher to be self-reflective. Sometimes teachers will say, well, why do I need to collect this data? I already know the student isn't doing well. And it's important to remember that this data primarily tells you as a teacher how things are going, how your instruction is going, rather than telling you more about how the student is performing. So it helps with both, but it's primarily there to help inform your instruction as a teacher. And so when we think about progress monitoring tools that are available, as I mentioned previously, our focus for this module is going to really be on those CBM measures. And we sometimes refer to those as GOMs, or general outcome measures. That means that we're evaluating how students are progressing towards a long-term outcome. It's not a short-term, like, I just taught words with the short vowel sound. A makes the A, and I'm trying to collect some data on that. I'm really thinking about overall general outcomes in reading, overall proficiency in reading. That's really the focus of CBM. We're trying to describe an individual student's long-term growth. It helps with initial decision-making for evaluating interventions. And those general outcome measures are evaluated and tested by researchers, and so we can have more confidence in them as teachers. Another type of progress monitoring tool that might be familiar to you, or might be familiar to teachers in classrooms where you've been, are mastery measures. These mastery measures might help to determine whether students have mastered a specific skill, but it's only part of what's expected in that particular area. So for instance, we're trying to get students to be better at decoding, and we're working on a particular blend or diagraph, and I'm assessing, do students know words that have the SH sound in them? I might create a list of SH words, and that's actually a mastery measure. It tells me that students have mastered or not mastered that particular sound segment. But it doesn't necessarily tell me overall how students are progressing toward meeting long-term goals. That's what we get from those general outcome measures. And so these are two types of progress monitoring tools, but again, we're really going to focus in our modules today on those CBMs. To further illustrate this difference between general outcomes and mastery measures, we see here an example of a phoneme segmentation measure. If we had a phoneme segmentation measure that had particular word patterns on it, words that all started, for instance, with the same sounds, words that had the same medial sounds, then that might be more of an example of a mastery measure. I've just taught these sound patterns, and I'm assessing how a student is progressing on those. In this case, because we have the variety of words that students are sounding out, this is more an example of a general outcome measure. This would be a general outcome measure to indicate whether a student is progressing on moving forward on some of those basic early literacy skills that we know are really foundational to help develop phonological awareness, for instance. Another example of a general outcome measure, and perhaps maybe a more common one, is this example of an oral reading fluency measure. So while reading aloud and counting number of words read correctly may not seem to be particularly groundbreaking or earth-shattering, there is a ton of evidence to support that oral reading fluency is an extremely good measure, very evidence-based, to provide an overall sense of how students are progressing and how proficient they are in reading. It's really our gold standard measure. This measure typically is given for 1 minute in that students read aloud for 1 minute. And this would be an example of a general outcome measure. So I want to stop for just a minute. I want you to talk a little bit with a partner. First, jot down just a few comments. What's the difference between a general outcome measure like CBM and a mastery assessment? I want you to think about your own practice or practices that you've seen in classrooms where you've visited, providing an example of each of those different types of measures, a CBM, a general outcome measure, and a mastery measure. And then let's come back together and share some of those examples. So we're going to move on next and talk a little bit about how to select an appropriate CBM that you can use with your students. But first, it might be helpful to think more about how these CBMs align with these big ideas in reading. You're probably familiar with the Big Five or the 5 big ideas in reading. Typically, we have these foundational skills that we're building for students, things like phonological awareness, decoding, vocabulary fluency, and comprehension. These are the areas of reading that we're really trying to focus on to move our students forward in reading. And one of the best ways to select a CBM is to think about the CBM that might be most appropriate according to which of the big ideas in reading will constitute the majority of your instruction according to the student's age and intervention needs. And so we sort of think of this as like a hierarchy of reading skills, and we have to think about where your student is entering into this hierarchy. So as an example of some of the measures that might be aligned with that first big idea, phonological awareness, we think about measures like initial sound fluency, letter sound fluency, phoneme segmentation fluency. Typically, these measures are given at the kindergarten level or for students whose reading is functioning at the kindergarten level. These measures are typically all auditory, so a teacher might give a particular word and the student has to say the sound they hear first. In some cases with letter sound fluency, the students may actually look at individual letters and say the sound, or in the case of phonemic segmentation fluency, we saw an example of that a minute ago, a word is provided to the student like cat, and the student has to say the sounds he or she hears, like k, a, t. So again, these phonological, if students are at that level where they're struggling with the phonological awareness component in the Big Five of reading, you might start with measures that focus on areas that might be tied to phonological awareness. Here's an example again of that phoneme segmentation fluency measure. Again, this sheet that you see here, this would be seen by the teacher. So the teacher would give the word like star, and we would be hoping that the student would say st, r. As the teacher is administering the measure, he or she can put a little line underneath the sound components that the student says correctly. So, s, t, r. Sometimes then in certain scoring programs, if the student does not say the sound correctly, like in the word yet, if the student said y, e, l, for instance, we would say y, e, and then actually put a slash through the sounds that the student does not say correctly. The number then that is graphed is the number of correct sound segments that the student says in the time that's given, which is typically 1 minute on this particular measure. Next, it might be that the student is struggling at the decoding level, and so we want to choose CBMs that align with those decoding types of activities. So these are some examples of typical measures that we might give if the difficulty that the student's having is at the level of decoding. Things like nonsense word fluency, word identification fluency, and oral reading fluency, which we sometimes call passage reading fluency. Again, these grade levels are recommended. This would be the grade level at which we would typically use these measures for sure for screening these students, but also we're thinking about the grade level that the students instructionally is at, and thinking about giving the student the grade level measure that matches where they are instructionally. Just to go back real quickly, an example of nonsense word fluency, for instance, would be made up words on a page, like a word like Zim, and students have to go through and say the sounds or say the entire word. They do that for 1 minute. Word identification fluency, lists of words, usually sight words. Students go through and identify words for 1 minute. And then we saw the example of the oral reading fluency measure earlier, a 1 minute oral reading passage at the grade level that the student is at instructionally. Sometimes the student's difficulty level lies in the area of fluency. That's the area that the student's struggling in that big 5. And so for fluency, again, we might be thinking about measures similarly to the ones we just looked at, like nonsense word fluency. Here's some examples of those pseudo words. Students start and move across the page like this, either saying the sounds, individual sounds, or they say the entire word. So the teacher has a scoring copy and is scoring as the student reads. If we look over here, if the word was tob, if the student says the individual sounds, we might say t, a, b. If the student says the entire word, tob, you would actually underline the entire word, tob. They get credit for the individual sounds they say. They also get credit for the full word that they say. You can see over here we've got, there are 14 total sounds in this first row of words. The number that you graph is the number of sounds correct or the number of total words correct. Just varies a little bit depending on the system that you're using. A nonsense word fluency, while we don't want kids to practice nonsense words, a nonsense word fluency is a great decontextualized way to have students demonstrate what they know about decoding, to really demonstrate that decoding fluency. Here's an example of a word identification fluency measure. As I mentioned earlier, students just say those words, and then oral reading fluency, that passage that they read aloud for 1 minute. Again, this is probably one of the most common CBM measures. Finally, it might be that the area of difficulty that the student's struggling in the big 5 areas of reading is the area of comprehension. And so in the area of comprehension, even though it seems sort of surprising that we might use oral reading fluency, we've determined from the research that oral reading fluency actually is strongly correlated with other types of reading tasks like comprehension tasks. And so oral reading fluency can serve as a good sort of proxy measure for how students are doing overall in reading. Sometimes teachers prefer to add some additional comprehension questions after that 1 minute of reading is done, just to get a better sense of how students are comprehending that text. Another typical, more context or comprehension-based task in CBM is maze. In some systems, this is called days. In this measure, which we'll take a look at in just a minute, students read along through the text. Typically, they're reading silently. When they come to 3 words in the passage, they actually circle the word that they think belongs in the passage. The recommended grades for these, oral reading fluency, as we mentioned before, grades 1 through 4. Sometimes we suggest that even students up through middle school can work on oral reading fluency at the grade level that they are instructionally. So we might have an 8th grader is reading at a 3rd grade level. They'd use the 3rd grade level measure. But we want to be careful that students aren't sort of topping out on those oral reading fluency measures. And so sometimes we move to these maze measures. It's not only perhaps capturing their progress better, but also sometimes it's easier for teachers to deliver because students read silently. They can be group administered, and sometimes that's more logistically feasible for a teacher who has more students in, say, a 6th or a 7th grade classroom. Examples again, oral reading fluency, as we've seen before. Here's an example of that maze passage. So as students move along through the passage, they're reading to themselves. Have you ever had nothing to do? Sometimes when I have nothing to do, can, so. And so they're sort of thinking to themselves, what fits in the passage? Sometimes when I have nothing to do, okay? So they're going up here and they're circling the word do. Sometimes when I have nothing to do, I take a walk. That's when I do. That's when I kick stones. So they actually are circling the word I. Later on, when the teacher goes back and scores these after the students finish, the teacher simply goes back, puts a slash through any words that are incorrect. So maybe this one was not correct. And then the number that's graphed is the number of correct choices that the student made in the time that was given. Sometimes maze is given for a little bit longer time, up to 3 minutes. So you need to make sure and check the system you're using. So the product you're using, check those time limits to use the time that's, that aligns with the administration directions for that particular measure. So you've seen examples of maze, you've seen examples of some of those early literacy measures and how those align with some of those areas of the Big Five. So I continue to mention some of the different products. I continue to suggest that there are products out there that you can choose from. How do you find what these products are? Well, I think the best place for you to look is to go to one of these tools charts on the National Center for Intensive Intervention website, intensiveintervention.org. They have experts that review the tools that are submitted in reading, mathematics, writing, and so it's a good place to go if you're wondering about what the research is suggesting about the characteristics of a tool you're currently using, or a tool that you're interested in starting to use. Good to go and check this chart, these tools charts, to determine what those characteristics are. Things like reliability, validity, whether these tools are good for progress monitoring. It's really important that you make the best decision about those tools you're choosing, because you're really going to be making some high stakes decisions using these tools. And so we really want to have a tool that you can be confident in. So we're going to stop for a minute and talk just a little bit about a case study again. We're going to look at an example of a student, John. He's a first grade student. He has some struggle with a few letter names and letter sounds. He struggles a little bit with blending and segmenting spoken language. And the majority of his instruction focuses on phonological awareness and early reading skills. So knowing those things about John, which CBM do you think you should use? So I want you to stop for just a minute and think about which CBM should you use. So if you suggested phoneme segmentation fluency, that's probably a good choice. You might have a rationale for another measure that you selected, but he's really focused at that phonological early reading skills level right now. He's working on letter names and sounds, so he's really not to the word level yet. Oral reading fluency is probably beyond him because that's really at the sentence level. So that phoneme segmentation is really that initial skill that he probably needs to focus on. So let's look at another example. Here is Cynthia. She's a 6th grade student. She has a reading disability, and her fluency instructional level is at the 5th grade. She scores around the 10th percentile in fluency, so she's pretty low achieving compared to other fifth graders who have taken that particular measure. She has particular struggles with vocab and comprehension, retelling what she's read. In other words, her decoding skills are about 1 grade level behind, and her vocabulary and comprehension are several levels below. Which CBM would you use? Oral Reading Fluency, Word Identification Fluency, or the Maze Days? Remember, that's the one where they read silently and select the choice. So think about this for a minute, jot down which one you would use, share with a partner. So if you selected Days or the Maze task, you would be on track. Why did we select that one? Really, we're thinking about, one, her grade level. She's 6th grade, and so she really needs to be focusing on those comprehension skills. Maze or Days is sort of a contextually based, choosing words according to how they fit into the context of that passage. She could use Oral Reading Fluency, but Days might be more grade level appropriate as we move up into these older grades. Sometimes, again, we find that these Maze or Days tasks capture that student progress more adequately than those Oral Reading Fluency tasks. So we're going to talk a little bit now about administration and scoring. This is a review of that Oral Reading Fluency CBM. In particular, for this section, we're going to focus on that DIBELS Oral Reading Fluency. Again, you should choose a measure that's a good fit for you. You can go back to those tools charts on intensiveintervention.org to make your best selection of a measure you can be confident in, but just for purposes of this module, we're going to be using the example of DIBELS. So the first step is to choose the level of the measure that you're going to be utilizing for oral reading fluency. And throughout this time, you've heard me talking a little bit about grade level measures, and you've heard me talking about instructional level measures. And so that's one of our first important decisions. Are we going to use grade level or an instructional level? A good guideline is that you're going to use grade level measures for screening, okay? So I really want to emphasize that, grade level for screening. For students, when we're screening all students in a grade level, in a school, in a classroom, we're going to have those grade level measures so that we can compare students' performance to the grade level peers who are taking that measure. So it might be grade level norms that are established. It might be peers within a school or a district that we're comparing to. And then typically another good guideline to follow is that for progress monitoring, excuse me, we're going to choose instructional level. Okay, so we're going to think about the level instructionally that the student is at, and we're going to choose that level for progress monitoring. So a student might be at a 4th grade level, might be at in 4th grade. For screening, we're giving those 4th grade level measures. The student might be reading at a 2nd grade level, so for progress monitoring, we're going to use that 2nd grade level measures to really chart that progress across time. If a student's performance is well below grade level, then grade level probes are unlikely to be sensitive to growth. So that's one of the things that we're looking at. If a student is scoring so low on those grade level probes, it really doesn't give us a good sense of the growth that students making. And so we then need to choose some of those off-level measures to help us get a more realistic sense of how that student's making progress. So this is always kind of a difficult decision to make, and sometimes, to be honest, it's kind of controversial whether we should choose grade level or instructional level. Some systems actually suggest that if a student is 2 or more grade levels, if their instructional level is 2 or more grade levels different, that then you should use instructional level materials. I think a good general guideline is use grade level materials for screening, use instructional level materials for progress monitoring. That's a great place to start, and then you can think about how to proceed from there. So, how do you determine the right instructional level? These are some general guidelines for how to determine what level the student's at. You may have other information already that tells you the grade level the student's at, and so you wouldn't have to do this. But if you need to know where the student's instructional level is, a good rule of thumb is to administer 3 oral reading fluency passages at the grade level at which you expect the student to be functioning by the end of the year, okay? So if we have a 2nd grade student, but you think they might be up into the 3rd grade level, if you have a student who's functioning at the 2nd grade level, but might, you think, be functioning at the end of the in 3rd grade at the end of the year, then choose those 3rd grade level measures. If the student reads less than 10 correct words per minute, you probably need to consider a different CBM. That's really too low. Those measures are too difficult. If they read between 10 and 50 words correct per minute, that's getting where we need to be for words correct. But if the accuracy is too low, like 85 to 89%, we need to drop down a level and try to get that accuracy to improve. Here's what we're shooting for. 10 to 50 words correct per minute and above 90% accuracy. That's really the range we want to be in. So right here, that's where we would say, yeah, we think that's a pretty good level to use. And then finally, if we have more than 50 words correct per minute, we likely want to move to the next higher level of text, where the student reads 10 to 50 correct words per minute. We never want to move higher than the grade level text of the grade that they're at, but we may want to bump up a level, okay? So we're shooting kind of for that, sometimes we call it like that just right level, but we're using words correct per minute and accuracy to try to really focus in on what that instructional level should be. But that should kind of help you get to the point you need to be. By the way, this suggests to administer 3 passages. Let's say that on the very first passage, a student, you can tell, like the student is really low on that passage, like right away it's below 10, and you think it's probably going to be below 10 on the next 2 passages. Then you can stop there, pick up the next set of passages that are at a lower level and try again. You don't need to necessarily administer all 3. I will say sometimes on the first round, students are a little slow to start. So keep that in mind. You know, it could be that they just need to kind of learn the task to warm up. So you can sort of keep that in mind. We really want to continue to consider the fidelity with which these are administered. So I know it's difficult sometimes to administer and score these the same way every time. There are distractions, things like that, but as much as you can, trying to follow the directions exactly the same way every time, trying to move the student to a quiet place, keep the amount of encouragement the same. So no previewing of the passage. This is, you know, what some would say is a cold passage. This is a cold passage. Keeping the amount of praise and things like that similar. You can talk about progress afterwards, but sort of keeping that amount of encouragement the same before each assessment. And then really thinking about making sure that you're following the scoring directions the same way every time. There are scoring, typically there are scoring directions with the different products that you select. It doesn't matter if they're so close, you know, oh, but, you know, I think they were on the right track here. You know, you just decide, you look at those directions, the scoring directions, you look at what they suggest, and those are the directions that you apply. You know, over time, we're going to see things even out if they have a difficult day, but we want to score them similarly each time. Accent, dialect, articulation related differences don't count as errors if the student follows the same pattern consistently. You'll know that better than anyone if you're working with the student. So you have to think about those articulation and accent and dialect issues and think about whether that's a pretty consistent pattern with the student. And you count the last response as their answer. Even if they changed a correct word to an incorrect one, the last one is the one that you're going to go with in the end. So sometimes they go back and they might change their response. They might update or sort of what we say self-correct. The last response then is the correct one. So let's take a little bit closer look at what these directions might look like for as a teacher's delivering them. So this is an example of the directions from the DIBELS Oral Reading Fluency. You're going to follow and read the directions exactly as they're provided. I'll go through these, and then in a minute we're going to actually watch a video of an administrator giving this measure to a student. So you might say, I would like you to read a story to me. Please do your best reading. If you do not know a word, I will read the word for you. Keep reading until I say stop. Be ready to tell me all about the story when you finish. You put the story in front of the student. Put your finger under the first word. So you actually point to the first word, and then you prompt the student to put their finger under the first word, and then you say, ready, begin. I think it's important, as teachers often ask, like, what about anxiety when we're timing students? On this ready, begin, this is not a race. This is about students' best reading. So I don't think you need to, have the timer out in front of the student. Ready, begin. Just a nice, calm, ready, begin. And move along, I think, should be sufficient. During the initial benchmark or baseline data collection, we actually give 3 passages to the student. And we're looking for if students read 10 or more words. Remember, we're trying to pick that passage that's at the right level for the student. When you're giving those next 2 passages for benchmark or baseline data, you don't need to use the full directions. Instead, you could say, now read this story to me. Please do your best reading. Ready, begin. But each week when you give a progress monitoring measure to a student, you need to continue to use these directions as they're scripted. During the testing, you start the stopwatch, or you might have, the timer on your phone running after the student says the first word. Okay, so if the student struggles with the first word, you mark the first word as incorrect. You say the word, and then you start the stopwatch. But you're going to start after they say that first word. Just a note about the device you use for timing. Don't use the clock that's mounted on the wall in your classroom that the second hand skips when it gets to 12 or something. Use something that is really accurate. It's important to keep really accurate check on that time. I actually like to use a countdown timer just so it's one less thing I have to pay attention to. So keep that in mind. And you're going to follow along and mark the responses in the scoring booklet according to the measure that you're scoring. At the end of 1 minute or the time that's allotted for the measure, you place a bracket after the last word the student said, and then you say stop and you remove the passage from the student. So a few other notes as you're administering oral reading fluency. You don't need to read the title to the student. If the student reaches the end of the page, go ahead and turn the page and continue on to the next page. We don't prorate the scores, so we're just going to continue reading. We just use the amount of reading that they accomplish in the time that's given. If the student's in the middle of a sentence at the end of 1 minute, you can allow them to finish the sentence, but you keep track and only score the words they said up to the end of 1 minute. Once in a while, I work with a student who wants to finish the story or the passage, you can certainly do that, but you're going to stop, at the end of 1 minute. You're going to mark on your page where the student was, and then you can, finish the story if the student wants to do that. Sometimes you don't have time to do that, but if you do have time, that's fine too. Just a few examples of scoring rules. The scoring rules are usually well articulated in the administration guide, so I'm not going to talk extensively about all the scoring rules today, but I'll just give you some brief ones that are pretty common. It's different than scoring perhaps something like a running record or some other type of miscue analysis that you might have done in the past. The scoring is meant to be really straightforward and efficient so that teachers can do it quickly, and it can be administered with ease and efficiency. So any words that the student reads correctly, you just leave those blank. Any errors that they have, you just put a slash through them. You don't mark a lot of, types of changes they made or self-corrections. You just leave the word the same, or you put a slash if they make an error. One of the changes that's sometimes different for folks who haven't scored these before is that if students insert a word, we actually don't count that. We just sort of ignore it. They have to read the word with correct pronunciation. An abbreviation must be read the way it would be pronounced. Numerals and hyphenated words have to be read correctly. Hyphenated words count as 2 words if both parts can stand alone. And if a student initially misreads a word but then self-corrects within 3 seconds, you can mark self-correct and they actually get credit for that. Self-corrections, yay, we want them to do that as long as it's within 3 seconds. Errors include words that are read incorrectly, substitutions, skip words. If a student hesitates for more than 3 seconds, then we actually count that as an error and move on. They move on to the next word. Students, if they come to a contraction like don't and they say do not, it's actually counted as incorrect. It's just the word don't would be incorrect. That's great that they know it, but that's actually not the printed word. And if a student skips a row, you're going to actually draw a line through the entire row, and all of those omitted words are counted as errors. So again, this is not exhaustive, but just to try to give you a sense of some of those things that are counted as errors. I'd actually recommend that you go back through and look through some of these slides, talk a little bit, with your group about some of those examples of things that are errors and not errors. As I mentioned a minute ago, the maximum time for each word is 3 seconds. So if they don't say a word within 3 seconds, you're going to say the word and then you mark it as incorrect. And sometimes it's hard to know, like, has it been 3 seconds? So you actually, if they're hesitating, I'd either count like off to the side. You can sort of put your fingers and count 1, 2, 3. In your mind, you can be counting, 1, 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000. So you want to give them enough time to give it a try, but also you don't want them to hesitate too long. And in some cases, you actually have to point and sort of to where the word is that they need to try next. In some cases, students actually are not doing so well on the measure that you've given them. Perhaps the level is too difficult. So if the student does not read any words correctly in the first row of the first passage, you actually discontinue administration. If there's a retell section, don't do the retell section. And you score at 0, and then you're likely going to have to move down to a lower level passage. If you're at first or second grade oral reading fluency and they need to go lower, then you're likely going to have to go back down to something like nonsense word fluency, even back to things like phoneme segmentation fluency. So you're going to have to go back to some of those early literacy measures if that first grade level oral reading fluency measure is too difficult for the student. But again, discontinue rule, if students can't read those words in the first sentence of the first passage, then you need to discontinue. You don't have them keep reading for the full minute. You actually say, thank you very much, and you stop, and then you're going to continue with a passage that's at an easier level. If there are fewer than 10, if they read fewer than 10 words in that first passage, also don't continue to administer any other portions. Like in some of the measures, there's actually a retell portion of the passage. So you're not going to administer that. You're going to record the score from the first passage. This just gives you an example of what the scoring book looks like for benchmark assessment for DIBELS. And so you can see you just record the score for the first passage, but you don't give those second two passages for benchmark. You can give some reminders as often as needed. If the student stops reading, then you say, keep going, keep reading. If the student loses his or her place, you can point. Sometimes this is really necessary for a student who is not using his or her finger to drag along. You may have to continue to sort of point to keep the student on track. I would avoid using like a piece of paper to drag down the measure. Sometimes that slows the student down. So encourage them to use their finger to point to the words to sort of keep on track. And as we mentioned before, the student is not penalized for differences in pronunciation due to dialect, articulation, pronunciations due to speaking a first language other than English. Some of this you may have to, if you don't know the student as well, you may have to actually talk to the student's teacher and get a sense of whether these differences are due to dialect or articulation. The longer you work with the student and get to know the student, you'll have a better sense of whether that's an error or if that's just a common pattern in that student's actual sort of everyday language. So now we're going to watch a couple of examples of an administrator giving an oral, giving a couple of these CBM measures to a student.
I would like you to read a story to me. Please do your best reading. If you do not know a word, I will read the word for you. Keep reading until I say stop. Be ready to tell me all about the story when you finish. Put your finger under the first word. Ready? Begin.
It was the day of the jump rope contest. Kim and Anna were going to complete. Kim was going to do a new trick. Anna was going to help. The two girls watched as yearning children who took a turn in the contest. The yearning children jumped and skipped rope in a circle. They were just beginning to learn fantastic trips.
Stop. Okay. Now, I'm going to turn this page. Now tell me as much as you can about the story you just read. Ready? Begin.
They were having a jump rope contest.
Can you tell me anything more about the story? Thank you. I would like you to read a story to me. Please do your best reading. If you do not know a word, I will read the word for you. Keep reading until I say stop. Be ready to tell me all about the story when you finish. Put your finger under the first word. Ready? Begin.
It was the day for the jump rope competition. Kim and Anna were good going to competition. Kim was good to do a new thing. Anne was good to help the kids.
Okay, stop. Okay.
Now that you've seen some video examples of how to administer those CBM measures, and we've talked about the administration and scoring a little bit, you might need other resources to examine. Here's a couple of other websites that you might check out for additional resources.